events. And our next speaker is Professor Paul Hoffman, who is the Murrell Distinguished Professor of History at Louisiana State University, well known as a southeastern-focused historian and very interested also in the Spanish period in the Caribbean. Professor Hoffman has worked with pretty much everyone on the panel, I met both Paul Hoffman and Jean Lyon first on a St. Augustine 1580 project many years ago, sponsored by the St. Augustine Foundation. And at that time, they were really developing the first serious, detailed reconstruction of what life must have been like in St. Augustine at that time, leading to a whole array of social history interests. Professor Hoffman has also worked very importantly on Santa Elena, St. Augustine's sister city in the 16th century, and the routes of explorers throughout the Southeast. He's published 8 books. I know we're familiar with many of them, probably for many of us here. His book, The Florida Frontier, is best known as an amazing compilation of history and social history of the Florida borderlands in the colonial period. Paul Hoffman has also recently, and I don't know how recent this is, but has developed a real expertise and focus on historical geography of Florida and the Southeast, on maps, mountains, rivers, and how that interfaces with history and people. And I am going to leave it at that. I'm not going to really mention that your other great interest is the history of LSU, and I'll let Paul go on about that if he'd like to.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Yes, I am, for my sins, interested in the history of LSU, but not the whole thing, fortunately. Not before the Tigers became a football power. I almost brought my Florida tie. I wore it yesterday when I gave an exam, just to tell my students that after all, great universities sometimes don't have great football teams. That was true when I was there a long time ago. But Florida, like LSU, has bitten the forbidden fruit. So we'll see what happens this afternoon, even as we speak. All right, my topic is the land they found or what they found. And it seems to me that historians, all too frequently, have paid no attention to the physical setting in which the stories they tell unfold. Now, this tendency is especially pronounced now that most of us work and live in buildings with air conditioning systems that buffer us from changes in temperature and humidity and generally shelter us from the direct effects of nature. Some of us are old enough to remember what it was like to be before air conditioning, but nonetheless. So for some histories, like those of the United States Congress, the physical setting is often not very informative. But for the history of settlement, the importance of the land and the general ecology of a given area should not be ignored, and certainly were not at the time, although that importance is not always recorded. Hence, having a chapter on the physical setting for the history of this state is valuable, and I thank and applaud Dr. Gannon for allowing me to contribute it to the history of Florida. I'm not talking here about geographic determinism, the old idea that geography, rather than human decisions, dictated what people did. That's an idea which has run its course, I think, and properly so. What I've written is rather a kind of historical cultural geography, with more emphasis right now in this paper on geography. Elsewhere, it's more emphasis on history. That is, a recognition of the interplay of culturally and historically determined things like, what is food? How do you raise it, if you're an agriculturalist? Or how do you hunt and gather it? And what you can do to the land to make it more useful to you as a place both to live and a place from which to get a living. Now, historical cultural geography teaches us that when Europeans arrived in the Southeast, they did not enter the fabled wilderness of the 18th century imaginary, but an ecology that human beings had been altering for up to 12,000 to 13,000 years at least, and intensively for several thousand before the Europeans arrived. It was also an area inhabited by agriculturalists who had found the better soils and village sites, given their foodways and technologies and the physical reality that they dealt with and altered as much as they could. So while I say at one point in my chapter that, quote, the qualities of the land for agricultural and other uses have been critical determinants of human settlement in the Floridas, unquote, you will understand that this is a highly qualified statement, reflecting, again, all sorts of ideas about expectations and technologies of the Native Americans, the Spaniards, the Africans, the English speakers, and finally Americans of all ethnicities who have brought and bring to the Floridas their particular ways of living in the world. Now, let me restate my point just a little bit, in a little more detail. Basically, what I'm saying is that when the Spaniards came to the Southeast, they found a pattern of larger Native American settlements shaped by the interaction of Indian agricultural technology, which was swidden, or what's sometimes called slash and burn, and digging stick for the maize, beans, squash trilogy, excuse me, and the geology of soils that could support multi-year cropping, were useful with that technology and were close to sources of fresh water for the villages and near ecotones. Ecotones are the gradations between usually more moist conditions below and drier conditions above. It's a slope. And on that slope, there is a great variety of plants and animals, although not all the animals are useful for human beings. But these are important resources for people before the modern period. So the larger settlements, or polities as the political scientists prefer and archaeologists prefer to call them, were in the Piedmont, on the river basins and on the terraces that did not usually flood. And later on I may show you a map if we get to that. Now along the coast, there were some smaller communities living with a combination of harvesting marine resources, especially from the marshes, and some agriculture, especially on hammock soils. Most of the coast is sandy, the soils are acid, and they make very poor agricultural areas. But in Florida, the flatwoods, which are just to the west of us here, flood during the winter rains, as some of you perhaps know more directly at first hand. So when Spaniards looked at the Southeast, what they wanted to do was to settle in the interior, not really on the coast, although that's, of course, where they ended up. De Soto's men, for example, remembered a place called Cofita Cheque, which had earlier been pointed to by a man named Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón as a possible place to live. It was an interior kingdom, and in the story that Ayllón had told, the people who lived there not only had a lot of food, they had a giant king who was white, interesting enough, and supposedly they herded deer and milked them to make cheese and other things. You can see there's a certain amount of wishful thinking here. The other place they remembered was Coosa, which is on the Coosa River, which runs from actually Tennessee down into northwestern Georgia and northeastern Alabama. Menendez de Avilés sent Captain Juan Pardo up the Wateree River and along the Catawba into the Piedmont and the Appalachians and had a notary record the qualities of the soils in terms of what Spanish crops would grow there and the presence of clays that could be used for building uses such as roof tiles and so on. In another record, the notary also recorded the chiefs who had come to pledge fealty to Spain's king and to receive gifts. The chiefs also agreed to put up stores of maize for possible Spanish use. So he's basically developing a road into the interior and tapping into the resources that he knew were there and that were found to be there, in fact. Now, the chapter that I wrote is organized so that I begin with the definition of La Florida as the Spaniards used it in the 16th and 17th centuries, both as an extensive, largely theoretical claim and in practice. The area in question grew smaller over time as the Spanish withdrew from the Carolina coast and in time, under English pressure, even from Georgia. By 1763, when the English took over East Florida, as they called it, the northern boundary had retreated from the cod fisheries of New England and eastern Canada to the St. Mary's River on the east and then 31 degrees west of the headwaters of the St. Mary's. The western boundary of the modern state was finally set in 1822 when the American Congress used the de facto Franco-Spanish Agreement of 1723 that the Perdido River would serve as a division between French Louisiana to the west and Spanish Florida to the east. Well, after getting that piece of the puzzle out of the way, I then turned to look at the general ecology of the southeast and La Florida, as the Spanish maps called it until at least the 1670s. When Spanish mariners first saw it, they thought that it was an endless sea of trees. Only slowly did experience reveal that in fact under those trees there was a coastal plain of varying numbers of geological terraces, all of them covered with acetic sands, that grew wonderful stands of pine trees and certain grasses that supported populations of deer and turkey, among other species. Cutting through those stands of trees, were river valleys with dense forests of hardwoods. Almost no Native Americans lived on the lower reaches of those valleys because of the danger of flash flooding and the difficulty of clearing the heavy forests. This pattern changes in the Piedmont to the extent that the floral and forest diversity increase and nut-bearing trees become more common. The soils are better, if still layered in various terraces, and the rivers are smaller, and thus there's less danger of flash flooding. On the coast as such, Native Americans with local knowledge were able to harvest the rich resources of the marshes and bays. That was true up and down the east coast of this peninsula and further up probably as far as Cape Hatteras. Now it must be said that for many Spaniards what came out of the marshes was not food. Fish, yeah, they knew that, and some shellfish and some other things, but a lot of the other plant materials they didn't consider to be food. Well, having surveyed the general picture with emphasis on soils, the essay then turns to consider conditions in the peninsula. And here I place emphasis on the Central Ridge and the Madison-Tallahassee Hills as places where the larger Native American settlements were found and where the 17th century missions developed and flourished until Old World disease, illegal but nonetheless tolerated exploitation of Native American labor, and finally the Anglo Creek raiding parties of 1702 to 1704, and some later, systematically destroyed the missions and cleared out of most of the peninsula the Native Americans who had lived in it since before the Europeans appeared. Now, after that, the Seminole and the Miccosukee peoples re-inhabited parts of the northern hills and the Central Ridge until they in turn were driven off by the advance of the American frontier in the early 19th century. Other English speakers had earlier invaded northeastern Florida, coming over from the Georgia line, in the late 18th century and became the basis for the westward and then southward expansion of U.S. settlements, with outlying pockets of farming, orange groving, fishing, and lumbering at places around the peninsula, but not in the interior of the peninsula. So again, what you see is a pattern in which first Native Americans pick the best soils, they're driven off, they're replaced by other Native Americans, and then finally Europeans move into the interior in a permanent way and begin to occupy the same area. Finally, after looking at the peninsula's rivers as avenues of communication, I turned to the question of climate. Now, La Florida, that is the southeast, has a long growing season, as many as 300 days in central Florida, 210 to 270 elsewhere in the southeast, about that 250 or so I think around here, making two crops possible in a year when the rainfall is just right. That observation leads in turn to a consideration of patterns of rainfall, especially in the spring and the summer, when they are governed by the Bermuda or the Azores highs. The climatologists like to call it the Azores high. When I was a kid, I learned it as the Bermuda high. But it's a big dome of high pressure that sits over the South and Middle Atlantic and moves back and forth. And when it's onshore, Georgia and northeast Florida generally have a drought in the summertime. When it's offshore, the rainfall is more normal and predictable and better for agricultural purposes. We know from Denver climatological studies that are done for Georgia and the Carolinas that in fact there is correlation between the periods of Spanish settlement, the settlement of Roanoke, and the settlement of Jamestown, and periods of drought. In all three cases, Europeans were moving in to live with Native Americans and try to take advantage of their agriculture in a period when that agriculture was in trouble because the rainfall was below average. And I was able to find for the 17th century periods when St. Augustine's production of maize was also down, and it correlates fairly closely, again, with periods when the rainfall pattern as measured by tree rings in Georgia and South Carolina is below the running average. As to say, below one standard deviation from the mean over time. And finally, in the paper, I look at the question of tropical storm strikes, which is also, of course, part of the environment, the ecology in this area. Now, we now have a fair idea of the El Nino-La Nina pattern of oscillations in the southern Pacific Ocean and how they affect the weather in the United States and the Caribbean, although a lot more needs to be learned about the effects in the Caribbean. What this new knowledge shows us is that the La Nina years between 1525 and 1850 were more common than the El Nino years, 140 to 110. Now that's out of a period of 324 years, so you can see there are a great number of years when there's neither a La Nina nor an El Nino, which may in fact be the case this year. Sometimes the La Nina years are much stronger. In fact, generally they're stronger and even extreme relative to the years that are El Nino that are strong and extreme. So there are more La Nina years, okay? In the 20th century, since 1850, there has been a slight edge for the El Nino years. The weather has actually been better. What happens when there's a La Nina is that there are no shearing winds over the Caribbean and the Atlantic, and consequently you can get much stronger hurricanes seasons blowing in to this area and into the Caribbean. So it's important to know whether you're in a La Nina or an El Nino year if you're going to sort of judge what the probability of getting a hurricane strike is. Now, at least one study that has been done of 20th century La Nina years has shown that when there is a La Nina, there's an 86% probability of a hurricane striking the peninsula south of Tarpon Springs or on the East Coast or on the Gulf Coast, that is the Panhandle or parts westward to where I live. The importance of this finding for colonial and 19th century history, I think, lies in the fact that most settlement in these periods was in the northeastern part of the state, spreading only slowly as far west as Mariana and then south toward modern Orlando. These are areas that seldom have direct strikes of tropical storms, and consequently, it's really a more favorable environment. Nobody, I think, at the time realized that, but that is in fact what happened. The only case that I know of, and Gene and Kathy may know of another, and perhaps Mike, is a tropical storm that in 1599 sent water all the way across the city of St. Augustine, which, as some of you may know, sits on a sand ridge, the highest point of which is St. George Street. And it must be, 5 feet above sea level, something like that? So it was not a very big, didn't have to be a big storm surge. This is not the Katrina kind of storm surge that you've seen in the papers in the last 5 or 6 years. This is probably much smaller than that, but it was enough to inundate the city and do a fair amount of damage. So that's sort of what I've done with the chapter. Now we'll see whether we can get there it is, what they found, right. Figure out which way to make this thing work. I guess that's the way. Yeah, click it, okay. Now, I apologize in advance for some of these slides. These are not professionally done. This is me with PowerPoint, but it will give you some idea of what's involved here. Let's see. Huh? There's an on-off switch. Is that the one with the red on it, or is that the other one? There it is. No, that's the pointer. How about that? There we go. No, that's not it either. Technology, you got to love this stuff. Absolutely. All right, so let's see if this works. Oh, there we go. All right, this is a map which I put together of the Southeast. And it's based on a very wonderful map by Rise, which shows, this is all done, it was all done by hand, by the way, before computers and all that sort of stuff. And it shows generally what the physical layout of the Southeast is. And I've indicated on there the fall line, some of the major Spanish sites, particularly Santa Elena, which is Paris Island, South Carolina, near Beaufort. Sapelo Sound, which was settled in 1526 and abandoned almost immediately, and St. Augustine. And I've also put in the fall line, and then down in Florida you can see the Central Ridge and also the Tallahassee and Madison Hills running across the north. These are the areas that were, particularly the hills in the center part, are most favored. And then I've indicated by a circle the approximate area that was of interest to Spaniards from De Soto onward, including Menendez de Avalos. Oops, wrong way. Here we go. Okay, this is a map which endeavors to show very, very briefly and very crudely the idea of the coastal terraces. In some places, the geologists tell us there are 6 or 7 or 8 of these things. In most cases, you've got to be a geologist to see them. But you can, in a few places, see them. For example, if you come up Highway 24, I think it is, from Cedar Key toward Gainesville, you will suddenly come to a place where the road goes up a hill. That's at the edge of a coastal terrace. Okay? And you can, and also down here on the, there we go. Down here on the coast, I'll show you in another picture that will show you a little bit better what that looks like in terms of the. And this is a map again which tries to schematically show you something about the forests. You can see that most of the Southeast is. Oops. Get back there. Come on. Get it right. Most of this is the pines that people saw. Most of that's coastal plain. Here's the Piedmont. And then these are the river terraces, the river valleys with their very heavy floodplain kinds of forest. This is the St. Johns River, as you'll recognize. Here's a little bit of the Suwannee, has some of that on it. The Chattahoochee and some other rivers over here. So these river valleys, particularly down in here toward the coast, were just basically empty. The Native Americans were not able to make much use of them. This again is to put the two maps together to show you where the fall line is. And relative to Native American settlement, again, I apologize for the poor quality, but you can see this is a fairly old map showing where the major settlements were, the major polities were in about 1540, which of course is the time of Hernando de Soto. And you can see that most of them are in fact inland. The bigger ones are inland. There are a few little settlements down here and a few up in here. There's the Tallahassee, Appalachia area. And then some folks down here on the lower coast of Florida. Then this is our friend Hernando de Soto, Spanish stamp with his picture on it. And you can see this is the best reconstruction of the route. And these settlements here are all on the fall line, which is an ecotone, more or less, and then up into here. And this is the area where, again, the Spaniards were primarily interested in moving in to settle because they had the understanding from Native American sources and their own exploration under De Soto and others that this was the area that had large populations, good soils, plenty of water, and looked like it could support their style of agriculture. For Florida, here's a satellite image that shows you the Central Ridge, right there. And we'll see this again in another picture. This is 2 slides. I'm going to go to the second image, this one, in a minute. This is a geological map that just shows all the underlying rock formations and so on. This is a much more useful map, and it looks like this one. And if you look at it, here's an inset which shows you, again, the central highland and the upper area, the island, the hills. And then you can see around here a kind of skirt, which is generally flatwoods. And then down here in South Florida, of course, other kinds of things. On this map, you can barely see the the flatwood skirts. There's some right here, there's some in here, some in here. You can barely make some of them out up in here, but here's the Central Ridge again. It comes down to about Brooksville, and pieces of it, you can tell by the red elevation, that's the higher ridges of it. That's the area that was the better soils, and then across here, again, better soils. In fact, there are early 19th century maps from atlases that say, right up here, good soil, okay? Good soil. So if you were thinking to moving to Florida in the 1840s, and you looked at that map, you would say, well, that's where I want to get my land, right up in here. Maybe down in here, but some of this had been taken up. The Arredondo grant, which is near Gainesville, is back in this area. The Spanish had granted out a lot of this area up in here, but not all of it. Okay. This is a map I picked up again. You know, Google is wonderful for maps. Don't tell anybody that I borrowed this, but anyway, this is the St. John's drainage. Let's see, get this right. Here we go. This is the St. John's Water Management District, and if you look carefully, you can see see this color right here? That's a terrace. And if you look over here, you can see another set of terraces, and pieces of one in here, and then pieces of one up in there. By this point, you're up on the Central Ridge. Okay, so even in Florida, even though it's very subtle between here and say Gainesville, there are a series of these terraces, at least according to the geologists, and the ones on the east side of the St. John's are generally not good for much at all, at least before modern times when you could do soil chemistry to them. This is a general map of the soil types in the United States. You can see there's an enormous variety. And then this is another map, which just focuses on two, aqualts and eudalts. The soil scientists about 15, 25 years ago decided that they were going to classify soils very much the way you classify plants and animals. And so they have these enormously complex kinds of classification schemes. And you can see just some of the other names that are there as well. This is a map of just the major soil groups in Florida. The best soils for agriculture are the ones that are in red, the eudalts, and you'll notice where they are, okay? Where the Appalachee lived and where the Timucua lived, by and large, right in here. Some folks down in here that disappear fairly early off the map, but these folks, this is the Timucuan area, this is the Appalachee area. I don't think there were too many Indians over there, at least I'm not aware of them. And then you can see down here the various kinds of wet soils. All this is the St. John's Valley, Kissimmee Valley, things of that sort, and of course the bays and so on. So when you start playing around with this stuff, you begin to say, well, of course, that's why South Florida, for example, is hardly developed until fairly recently when we had the technological means to transform the environment so that it was useful to us. But before the 19th century, and arguably before the 20th century, people who came here had to put up with what they could find. You could burn the trees, but you couldn't do a whole lot about the slopes and the drainage. Whoops, excuse me. So in one of my books, Florida Frontiers, I put this map together. There's a slightly different version of this that covers the whole southeast. It's in the History of Florida book. But this, again, is intended to show where the major soil groups are that are really good soils. This is the Central Ridge again. And then here again is Appalachie. And then down here is the Everglades and all that sort of thing. And you can see there's somewhat the same kind of wet soils over in here, and some in there, and some up in here as well. The other soils, these areas, the white areas, represent mostly flatwoods kinds of soils, but in terraces and that sort of thing. So again, the pattern of settlement tends to fit with the geography, but modify it over time. And then finally, just put this together again to show the same earlier map, but in this case, where the areas of the Spanish missions are. Oops. And it somehow managed to drop. Oh, there it is. Yeah, there is another one there. This is an area right here. This is the Georgia missions, the Wale missions, so-called. Here are the Timucuan missions, approximately, and here again are the Appalachee missions. So you can see the Spaniards went and had real trouble, as I think Gene may talk about a little bit, others will talk about, with the missions in this area. That's where they really wanted to go. They never could get there in any force. And then I just put a little eye candy in here that I picked up somewhere else, just for fun, because it's well to remember that this is a beautiful place, in spite of the fact that it's a terrible place to try to make a living if you are an agriculturalist and particularly if you're trying to grow something that's not native to the area or that's not something that the Indians knew how to grow. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention.
My question is, what is Florida for all of you guys? Is it a state? Is it a state of mind? Is it a state of being? Is it a region? What is it? And why is that important? Because, you know, we've got this book, this history of Florida. We've got the new history of Florida, which is now the old history of Florida. We've got the true history of Florida. But what is Florida?
All of the above. All of the above, indeed. Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me expand on the idea of the importance of at least Spanish Florida. I won't comment on the statehood period because it's not something I know much about. But in the colonial period, at least up to, well, arguably 1670, when in the Treaty of Madrid in 1670, Spain and England agreed that Spain would recognize England's colonies in the New World, which it had refused to do up to that point. So that made Carolina, as it turned out, which had been founded just before that treaty was signed, plus Virginia and everything north of that, and several places in the Caribbean, that made them officially English and settled one of the issues. But I think that the significance of Spanish La Florida, not just the state we're in, is that it really pushed the English further north, and in pushing the English north away from Santa Elena, with the riches that Menendez hoped to tap but didn't, because he died too soon, that, you know, sort of the dumb luck of the English, they ended up in a place where, after a very severe trial, as we should all know, they managed to find a crop that would grow and be profitable, and that became one of the two foci for the development of what becomes the Anglo-American United States. And it also gave us one of the characteristics that some of you know that there are two schools of thought about American history. There's one school that was based in New England that said, well, we're the city on the hill, this wonderful place where people came for religious liberty, et cetera, kind of the high idealism that attends the idea of the United States. And then there's another school which arose out of Johns Hopkins and Jack Green's activities as a historian, which is called the Chesapeake Bay School. And basically it says, well, that may be true in New England, but down in the Chesapeake Bay, it was the devil take the hindmost and every man for himself, kind of the American entrepreneurial capitalist spirit. And in effect, the Spaniards, at least under Menendez, brought that to the United States. It never quite carried through the way that it did otherwise. But I think that the real importance is that it really pushed the English further north.
Anybody else on the panel? Michael?
No, I'm just always impressed by Gene's knowledge. He has made Pedro Menendez Avilés a specialty of his research and writing career. And with so much effect now, the name Menendez is catching on in American literature generally. There is a book that came out about 20, 25 years ago, What Every Cultured Person Should Know. There were two names missing from that list, Pedro Menendez and St. Augustine. Now there's a new edition and both those names are in the book. And I think it's in great part because of the great work that Gene has done. I've been lucky in my lifetime to have accompanied Gene to various archives in Spain. And it's just marvelous the way he cuts to the heart of every collection, and he sits there reading aloud from these wonderful pages of yesteryear. It may be said that Gene lives in the past, but we all who call ourselves historians lived in the past. And what we hope is that at moments like this, we can bring that past alive. And I think that's what the historians are doing for us today, and we'll do again tomorrow.
One thing that kind of attracted me is we have two kind of parallel stories here that we talked about. We have Paul's story of geography, and we have Gene's story of great men and this imperial Atlantic world. And I'm interested to know how they intersect, because they seem to be working in very parallel lines, but they really do intersect. I'd like to hear more from each of you how Paul's story intersects with Gene's story, and how Gene's story intersects with Paul's story to kind of develop this movement of colonization of the Spanish.
I'll defer to Gene first.
I think there's a real intersection where the new settlers, which Menendez brought to Santa Elena, and the spearhead set out under the command of Juan Pardo, they were always looking for the same thing. They were looking for good soil, and they were looking for a chance to find that good soil. And they just couldn't do it as long as there was dispute and problem.
Well, when the Spaniards came to found St. Augustine, Gene, were they not enormously disappointed to find that the foods to which they were accustomed, grains such as oats and barley, would not grow in the low sandy soil here? And yet Menendez sent Juan Pardo on an expedition into the interior of what we call the southern states today, particularly to Carolina, through the Carolinas to Tennessee. And there they found very arable soil in which everything would grow. And you would have thought that Menendez would move his settlement up there, where there was such rich arable land. But he did not.
And yet, here's a letter from Pedro Menendez Marquez, 1579. He had the people plant much corn, which sort of becomes a substitute for wheat. Much corn, and they got 1,000 fanegas. It begins to produce much fruit, such as figs, pomegranates, oranges, grapes, mulberries, vegetables and greens, kidney beans, habas beans, melons, squash, lettuce, artichokes, onions, and garlic. So,
And where?
Here in St.
Here in
Augustine.
St. Augustine.
All right, falls to me then to connect Menendez to the land. I think you did the land to Menendez, or the other way around. Anyway, what I would say is this. Until Menendez came along, the story of what we commonly call the exploration and attempted settlement of Florida is a long story of failure. And it's a failure in large part to bring to bear the resources of the Spanish Empire, which Menendez did. He was from the get-go, he was a man on the make. He knew how to make use of the economic opportunities of his time, and he brought to Florida, as Gene has pointed out to us today, an enormous amount of resources, personal resources. And he was able, in part because of the king's own concerns, but to get the royal resources to make something out of what was an extremely difficult environment. And my sense of men of the time, in the Atlantic, Spanish Atlantic at least, is that he's probably the only person that could have done that. And certainly the only one who tried to do it, but he's the only person who could have done that. So I would highlight the importance of the man and the resources he brought, trying to make the best out of a number of imperatives, one of which was the king's desire to make sure that the Spanish flag was planted wherever the French flag had been planted. We now know, for example, that at Santa Elena, the first Spanish fort's smack on top of the French fort, Charles Fort. And the same thing was true at San Mateo, which was Fort Caroline originally. So basically, that was one of the imperatives: replace the French with the Spanish flag because even though the Spaniards officially said, well, we own the whole New World because we discovered it and because the Pope gave us the right to evangelize it and because we signed a treaty with the Portuguese that divided the Atlantic, in fact, the Spanish position by the 60s was effective occupation, which was the position of the French and had been for 50 years by that point. So it was important to do that, to put the flag where the French had been, and that constrained some of what Menendez did. But nonetheless, he did it.
May I ask, we're almost at near the break time, but I would like to ask if, with the land and Menendez and the French on all of these themes, do you think that if the French had been in a different part of La Florida or had not been here, that Menendez would have established St. Augustine here?
That's counterfactual history, but the answer is probably yes. He probably would not have established St. Augustine
Would not have established it at all?
at all.
I think it's accidental.
The accidental city.
Well, a better way to put it
accidental
is,
Florida.
history is full of contingencies, okay? Things happen that are not planned or intended. And so you end up with what you end up with.
Well, let me ask one more question, and then I'll open it up to the audience. Paul, I'm real interested in the really provocative notions about climate and ecosystems and everything else, and how the assumptions of the Spanish that this was a wilderness area, and how the Native Americans shaped this, and particularly by fire, and then also how this land was shaped really significantly by the Spanish settlement and the people who came here and what they did to the land and with the land.
Oh, gee, lots of different things. Fire, as you may or may not know, North Florida used to be covered by longleaf pine forests, which are pyrogenic. That is to say, they really require fire to really get going because longleaf pine, unlike all the other kinds of pine that are grown in Florida now, will tolerate a ground fire. And so periodically lightning, which is very frequent in this area as well, sets off fires. And until suppression occurred in the 20th century, it would burn whole areas. I think there was recently a big fire over in Ocala National Forest, if I remember, the last 5 or 10 years. And so that's a very important element in shaping the ecology. I think the main thing that Spaniards do to shape the land is they bring in a variety of plants and some animals. They had trouble initially with the cows and some of the other animals because of insects and Indians and Spaniards who decided they would get a little meat on the side when the owner wasn't looking. But basically, they did eventually bring them in, and the degree to which European cattle and the weeds that they may have had in their guts when they were brought in, primarily from the West Indies by that point, altered the ecology here. I'm not qualified to say, but I imagine that there's some people that have ideas on that. So they do shape the land to some degree. They certainly reshape the settlement of Native Americans once they get the mission chain going across on the road. And as that population decreases, John Worth has shown that they move people around to keep enough people in the way stations so that you can keep moving the goods back and forth across the land. I don't know if that answers your question fully or not. It's a sad one.
It's certainly true that the citrus groves, which used to be up on Merritt Island and elsewhere, spread from original Spanish citrus. And in fact, my wife's brother, who was a citrus man, said he knew of a grove which they called, Spanish.
Spanish grove, yeah.
Yeah, there were also, St. Augustine grew citrus for export until 1820 or 30, somewhere in there, and there was a big freeze that killed all the trees. And then they began to move the cultivation south. So, that was, when that all started, it's not clear, but probably this quote from Menendez Marcus in 79 is an indication of that.
Okay, well, let's open it up to questions. Hopefully, you guys have been excited enough to interact with everyone on the panel, so please step up and speak your piece.
Good afternoon. I'm Rob Blunt, Mission Director at Mission San Luis de Apalache in Tallahassee. And I first want to thank the St. Augustine Historical Society, and particularly under the leadership of Dr. Parker and Dr. Deegan, for putting together the Florida History All-Stars. This is really, really terrific. I want to, though, address Dr. Gannon's presentation. Toward the end, he mentioned that there may be one Appalachian family remaining in Mobile. And I would add, throw out to the panel the research that has led to the filing of a claim with the BIA for recognition of approximately 300 Appalachian Repeaties Parish, Louisiana. I mean, this has been going on since about, what, the late 90s?
I heard about that. Many people make such a claim. I met one family at the ordination of the new Bishop Esteves. That family came over from Mobile at the invitation of the bishop in order to establish some kind of reconnection between the church and the old Spanish mission Indians. And they knew that he was a symbol, but he was very confident in his claim that he did descend from the Apalache families that fled Appalachian country in 1704 when Colonel Moore from Carolina came south to rampage and enslave and kill in the worst slaving raid in the history of our country, and in one of the great massacres of all time. And he and his family claim to have escaped death and live today in Mobile. I don't know of any other great number. I've just met that one family.
Well, living in Louisiana, I can assure you that there is a large group of people who are descended of the Appalachian who left Mobile after a while and moved to the Red River. And that's the group you're talking about, the 300 or so, yeah. Yeah. So they obviously not everybody moved. Some people stayed. And there are probably people who are descendants of the Appalachian insofar as there are any Indians left in South Carolina and Virginia that are, quote, the Yamasee, unquote. Because there's a lot of intermarriage between the people up on the coast, as we would think of them, and the folks in Tallahassee area. But yeah, they're all connected. I have no opinion, by the way, on the merits of the claim as for recognition.
And trying to figure out the merits of the claim.
Except that if they do get recognition, they also get a casino. So there is a reason.
They are currently being, their DNA is currently being tested and compared to the bodies that were exhumed at Bishop San Luis.
I'm sorry, I can't.
They're currently being tested, their DNA is being tested and compared to the remains that we excavated at Bishop San Luis.
Yeah.
And the Mobile group is the ones who have visited San Luis and are part of that, but they have a very long archaeological tradition in that area that University of South Alabama has been working on, really connecting them through pottery and other things to the Appalachia of Northwest Florida. It's a wonderful story.
Anybody else? Great.
My name is Nancy Sykes-Klein. I'm the Vice Mayor of the City of St. Augustine, and I want to welcome you here. Thank you so very, very much. I have a question, and this is kind of not fair to the rest of you, but because I've already had an opportunity to ask Dr. Deegan this question, but it's my favorite question to ask historians, and that is, what would you attribute to the survivability, sustainability of St. Augustine for so many years? If there was one thing that you could attribute it to, would it be climate, soils? We've already heard personality, leadership, in those realms. What would that be? And I'll sit down. Thank you.
Well, I'm a survivor of St. Augustine.
You have personality, that's for sure, Mike.
weekends, the city descended into the uproarious colonial behavior that you saw hundreds of years ago, as gangs of alcohol-laced soldiers ran up and down the streets and the sidewalks. And the MPs and the Shore Patrol were throwing fallen women out of hotel rooms. And there were fights everywhere, the MPs and SPs breaking up fights between Army and Navy personnel, or sometimes it was intramural. But it was a very violent and incredibly complex time, and I loved every minute of it. It was a time in which a lot of people came to St. Augustine not having heard of the city before, and in a way transformed it, and they were possibly transformed by it. I remember the 36th Infantry National Guard from Texas. They were particularly riotous. They would go into Glick's famous bar, 52 Cathedral Place, and put nickels into the jukebox machine to hear Deep in the Heart of Texas. And then they would go around and pull people up to a standing position where they forced them to remain while the song played. And sometimes it played for 4, 5, 6, 10 times before you could regain your seat. It was that kind of a place. And during that period, I was a bellhop at the Alhambra Hotel. There are only a handful of people I recognize here who would remember the Alhambra, one of the most interesting hotels you can imagine. And every year we had the cockfighters. And you can't imagine a movie being made about that period without showing the cockfighters and the way they talked, behaved themselves, the dice games at night, and they would call down to the desk and say, "We want the wall torn out between room 26 and 28 so we can extend the dice table." And the manager saying, "No problem, sir," and calls Mr. Waking, the construction engineer, and he's there with his men. They take it down and so forth. It was that kind of a world. So I saw a picture of life that really ought to be made into a movie, and I will say I survived it. And I think I came. It wasn't too hard a thing to grow up fast. I found that. You can grow up fast or grow up slow. I grew up fast, and I think it was all to my own good. It was quite a slice of life to see. So I'll just give you that little picture from a more recent period of our city's history.
And I hope that reassures Commissioner Klein that things have, Sykes Klein, have really improved in St. Augustine under the current regime.
Another part of the answer is that until the British showed up in 1763, and all the Spaniards or Hispanics who were here left, the thing that kept the town going was the royal payroll. And then once everybody left, the British came in and said, "Well, here's the whole town. We got a lot of houses, we got a fort. Why should we move?"
Yeah, but all the Spanish didn't leave.
Well, that's not what I've been told, but maybe I'm wrong.
No, no. No. No, there were 3 left by the Spanish government,
Okay, 3.
and they never left. And their families are, in fact, our families go back to the original families that came over with Menendez. They weren't, our surname became Solana, but we were part of the Perez, the Solana and the Sanchez, but we were part of the Perez family that came over with Menendez, and we never left. And then all the Menorcans came, and then we all intermarried. So there, I think in all these seminars, the problem I have, I'm fascinated by Dr. Lyon's story because I always hear something I didn't know before about the early history. But it seems to me the historians totally disregard the families that were here in the beginning and built this city and built this state. And I think the geology that you were talking about, I thought that was, or the geography of the land was very good information, and that all the old family, the Spanish, all my descendants in the Menorcans, they all moved west of St. Augustine and south of St. Augustine, ranchers, and my descendants had haciendas up and down on the west part of the coast. In fact, when Florida became a state, my descendants sued the United States because they had raided Florida so badly and destroyed his cattle industry. And like I said, these family members are still here and our history's still alive. And we've done, on our own, done a lot of research. And we can actually, and with books that a lot of historians have printed. And it seems to be something that's kind of overlooked. We're still here, and there's a lot of us here. We're not talking about 50 or 60, we're talking about hundreds, maybe even thousands. So we're still here.
Well, yeah. It is a common observation that I would make that the social history of St. Augustine is largely untold.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
And, Kathy did some important work just in terms of, the social structure measured by pottery and some things like that. But the other kinds of resources, there are studies of demography, but that's people in the aggregate. And so the social history side of it is one of the areas that's just has been neglected.
Well, the Perez's came, and we can't get very much information about them. Some of that we went back to Dr. Lyons, some of his manifests that came with Menendez, because the first documented marriage that we can get a record of for the Solanas is 16, or I don't know whether it was a marriage, yes, 1620 in that area, or 1630, is because they married a Perez. But anything, I think there was some damage done to the church records in that around 1600 or whatever. So our link, we have trouble going back further. But our family, we have these seminars here, and our family was in a part of every bit of them. I have an ancestor that was the deputy governor of Appalachia. He fought the Indian Wars over in the Gulf Coast against the Indians. In fact, he took 2 sons with him with the army. They lost, this was in they had Indian Wars all the time. But he lost a son. And so there's, our descendants were the secretary to the governor of Florida all through the years because they were the only ones that could read and write. And several of our descendants were actually priests at the church here. Father Solana, he's the one when they had the mutiny at the fort, the soldiers went to him. And then they had a big trial in Cuba. So, there's a lot of big history. And when they burned St. Augustine, when they were invaded by the British, it was my ancestor that read the order that the town had to be burned. So, it would be nice if somebody could, make allusions, or maybe they don't realize there's that many of us here.
Well,
Could I return to the topic of food again? I know that Jean has pointed out in a wonderful book, Richer Than We Thought, that the higher echelon of St. Augustine Society did have access to foods of their own choice, imported from Spain, some size, many luxury items in the food category. But Kathy and her archaeological colleagues have discovered that for the mass of citizenry, including the soldiers, there was very little food, at least very little food that they would eat. But they ended up at last eating the native diet prepared by native women with their food preparation techniques. I wonder if she would speak to that as an addition to this conversation on food.
Well, I would speak just very briefly, since we're about out of time, but that, yes, Dr. Gannon is right that the Spaniards quickly, I think, either had to learn to live with the local resources and lands or not make it, and that may be part of the question, or the answer to your question, that people, the Spaniards did learn, they were willing to accommodate and adapt other races and other, well, not other religions, but certainly there was an adaptability that we don't see in a lot of the other colonial areas, and a big part of that is seen through the food. Thank you for bringing that up, Mike. But
One more question, and then we'll, or two more questions? Good. Perfect.
since we begin again at 3:30.
No, we're going to 3:45.
Oh, good, okay, good.
My question is a simple one, but first, Dr. Gannon, I'm glad that you were able to be here and do everything you've done, and I thank you for all you always do for us. My question, though, is for Dr. Lyon. I have been conducting tours for tourists for more than 10 years and talking about Menendez. I've yet to be able to explain to them how he marched 500 men from here up to Fort Caroline, and you touched on it, but I wonder if you could tell me the best way, tell all of us, to explain what route he took.
Well, I understand he took a route up the west side of the North River.
The
Of
west
course,
side,
the further up he got, the more convoluted the trees and the grapevines and everything else began. But he had Vizcayan axemen to cut his people's way through. And moreover, they had not only Indians, but they also had one or more of these Frenchmen who had been to Fort Caroline, who knew where it was, to guide him. So they went through, and I really don't believe this was a hurricane. I think it was a northeaster.
that's
It was
pretty
a
much what I
northeaster
said.
because it lasted about 4, 5, 6 days. And you've all seen northeasters like that. A hurricane, usually very few of them hang around.
But that's a lot of what the people question, and if I bring them up and down A1A, the North River is over on the side, and they wonder where he was, on which side, so that will help me explain to them.
Well, that appears to me to be what happened. And then once they got up to the point where they had to cut across from North River, or the remnants of it, cut across to the St. Johns River, where the fort was, they had to cut through very heavy live oak and grapevine with those axemen from the north of Spain who knew what they were doing.
Okay, well, that will definitely help me explain it. Thank you.
I also want to thank you, and I've been a volunteer with Kathy on several digs. And I want to pick up on something that Dr. Hoffman said to answer Commissioner Sykes-Klein. And I'm retired Air Force, okay. The reason St. Augustine has survived and been continually occupied for 300 or for 450 years, especially for the first 250 years, is because there has always been a military presence here, protecting the city from the Indians, from the English, from the Americans, colonists, whatever you want to call it. But that's the military, the 450th Military Commemoration Committee is trying to bring this to the public's knowledge, that the military is here and providing, as you said, the money, the royalty, that the soldier's salary was the float for the city. As long as the Situato came. If it didn't come, well, then it's all barter. But today, there are more than 20,000 military retirees, veterans drawing VA pensions or disability pensions, the Florida National Guard. The military is still supporting St. Augustine to the tune of millions of dollars a year. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the panelists for a great first session. And to answer my question, I started my questions with what is Florida, and based on what they said, I think I may have come up with an answer. Florida is the interaction of people, and not just great people like Dr. Lyon talked about, but ordinary people too. And not just Spanish, but Native Americans, and as we'll see later, not just Native Americans and Spanish, but Africans as well. It's the interaction of all these people with the natural environment. So to me, that's what Florida is, and we learned about that this afternoon. Thank you very much. And come back for the next session.